For centuries, Poland has faced betrayal, oppression, and brutal aggression from its eastern neighbor. From secret pacts and mass executions to deliberate sabotage and war crimes, Russian interference in Polish history has left deep scars that still shape relations today. But what exactly happened? Why do Poles remember events that Moscow tries to erase? Today, we uncover the dark history behind Poland's enduring resentment toward Russia. In September of 1939, the armies of Nazi Germany and later the Soviet Union entered Poland. This invasion was coordinated and agreed upon in a secret protocol of the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which outlined the division of Europe into spheres of influence. On the 17th of September, at 6 in the morning, the Red Army crossed Poland's eastern border. The invasion force consisted of 4,000 Soviet tanks and 600,000 soldiers. At that time, most of the Polish forces were engaged in battles against the Wehrmacht, leaving little resistance against the Soviet offensive. As was typical of Russian military tactics, the attack was carried out without a formal declaration of war. The Red Army struck treacherously while the Poles were already fighting the Nazis. The Soviet occupation was officially presented as a liberation of fellow Ukrainians and Belarusians from Polish oppression. However, it was accompanied by deception and brutality. Soviet propaganda films, such as Alexander Dovzhenko's Liberation, depicted the Red Army as noble and just, while portraying the Poles as weak and laughable. However, the reality was far grimmer. After the Soviet occupation, the Red Army captured or interned between 250,000 and 500,000 Poles, including soldiers, politicians, public figures, police officers, and clergy. While some prisoners were released, tens of thousands were deported to Siberian labor camps, Kazakh settlements, or held in prisons across Ukraine and Belarus. Among them were approximately 23,000 Polish officers, many of whom were intellectuals and professionals such as journalists, teachers, doctors, and lawyers. In March of 1940, Soviet authorities, led by NKVD chief Lavrentiy Beria, proposed their execution. The Politburo approved this secret order, sentencing over 21,000 Polish officers to death. Mass executions took place in several locations, the most infamous being the Katyn forest near Smolensk. Prisoners were told they were being transferred home, but instead, they were transported in groups of 354 per train to execution sites. Soviet executioners shot them and buried them in mass graves. Once the massacre was completed, NKVD officials reported, "The operation of unloading and burying is finished." When Polish officials in exile inquired about the missing officers, Stalin dismissed their concerns, stating that the prisoners had escaped to Manchuria. It was only in later years, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that Moscow partially admitted to this crime and released some documents regarding the massacre. The Katyn Massacre was not the only time the Soviet Union acted against Poland. In 1944, Polish resistance fighters of the Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising against Nazi occupation. This was the largest uprising in occupied Europe, involving between 40 and 50,000 insurgents armed mostly with small weapons. The Soviets, despite being near Warsaw, deliberately halted their advance, allowing the Nazis to regroup and crush the Polish resistance. Red Army units stood idly by, watching as German forces brutally suppressed the uprising with tanks and bombers, ultimately razing much of Warsaw to the ground. For decades, the Soviet regime suppressed mention of this uprising, as it contradicted the official narrative of Soviet support for Poland. Soviet betrayal of Poland was not an isolated incident. The history of Polish-Russian conflict dates back much further. In 1772, Poland, weakened by internal strife and Russian interference, was partitioned for the first time by Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Moscow manipulated Polish politics, using bribery and corruption to weaken the state. The Russian ambassador in Warsaw effectively controlled Polish affairs. Despite promises that this partition would be the last, Russia participated in a second partition, 21 years later, and a third in 1795, effectively erasing Poland from the map. The Petersburg Convention, signed by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, decreed that the name Poland should never be used again. Russia claimed its annexed territories as historically Russian lands, a justification eerily similar to its modern rhetoric. Resistance to Russian rule was met with brutal repression. After the Polish Uprising of 1794, Russian forces led by General Suvorov slaughtered over 20,000 civilians in the Praga district of Warsaw, including infants. This event, known as the Praga Massacre, is a stark historical parallel to modern atrocities committed by Russian forces. In April of 2010, a plane carrying Poland's top leadership, including President Lech Kaczynski, crashed near Smolensk, killing all 96 passengers. The delegation was en route to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Katyn Massacre. Initially, multiple theories emerged regarding the cause of the crash, including pilot error and poor weather conditions. However, in the years that followed, especially after the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, the annexation of Crimea, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the possibility of Russian foul play gained renewed scrutiny. To this day, Russia refuses to return key parts of the wreckage to Polish authorities, fueling suspicions that the crash was no accident. Poland's President Andrzej Duda recently stated, "We know very well what Russia is." A statement rooted in centuries of Polish experience with Russian aggression. From the brutal partitions of the 18th century that erased Poland from the map to the Soviet invasion of 1939, the mass executions of the Katyn Massacre, and the calculated betrayal of the Warsaw Uprising, Poland has repeatedly found itself the target of Russian aggression. Each act of treachery and violence left deep scars, shaping the nation's historical memory and its perception of its eastern neighbor. These are not just stories from the past, they are lessons that remain painfully relevant today. The echoes of history continue to resonate, serving as a stark warning about the enduring nature of Russian imperial ambitions and the cost of underestimating them.